Early on in my ministry, one of my mentors cautioned me about outdoor worship services, specifically officiating at outdoor weddings. Worshiping in a place where you cannot control the environment, he explained, can be a terrible disturbance to the worship experience. Rain, not to mention lightning, noisy traffic, barking dogs, horseflies, sweat bees, mosquitoes, wind gusts, etc., may all become uninvited liturgists. A few years after my ordination, I agreed to officiate at a wedding on a yacht on the Sassafras River, which is an aquatic finger of Maryland's Chesapeake Bay. The wedding would be an all-day event, beginning in one county, then making its way slowly down the river to an adjacent county where the ceremony itself would take place, as per the marriage license. The wedding day arrived, and the weather was picture perfect. I love boats and being on the water, but I am prone to motion sickness. So after taking Dramamine, I boarded the yacht and was ready for a bright, celebratory, and sunny day on the water. As we slowly motored down the tributary, socializing with cocktails in hand, the yacht began to rock. There was not a single cloud in the sky, but the water became increasingly rough. Who knew an estuary could generate such waves? After about an hour of rolling down the river, we reached the county where the wedding ceremony was to be held. And I am not kidding when I say that the water was so rough that we had to attach ourselves to something stationary in order to keep from toppling over. As I presided over the wedding ritual, I grabbed the nearest fixed object, the wet bar, atop which bottles of beer were now sliding from one end to the other and back again. What happened next is what makes the event so indelible. Right in the middle of the nuptials, the mother of the bride, whose face had become a pale shade of green, slapped her hand over her mouth, turned, and quickly stumbled out of the ceremonial space. One by one, all the wedding guests began to exhibit signs of seasickness, and one by one, attendees peeled away and staggered, and not because of alcohol consumption, to the nearest head. One last thing I remember about that day, I stood absolutely alone in the sunshine on the yacht's upper deck, thankful for my Dramamine, filling and refilling my plate from the beautiful buffet of freshly steamed shrimp, crisp, ripe fruit, and newly baked pastries. In the years that followed, I have presided at many, many outdoor events, always trying to anticipate the arrival of uninvited liturgists well in advance. A few years ago, I was in upstate New York at the home of a young couple, longtime friends of my family, who were about to tie the knot. They had anticipated rain, and had erected a large tent over rows and rows of folding chairs. The rain poured down on that picturesque setting, but beneath our canopy, we all stayed dry. The white aisle runner was rolled out, and the wedding party, followed by the bride, processed down the pristine runner and took their places. Just as Jess and Jake were about to exchange rings, I heard a commotion. I looked up, and there, bouncing up the center aisle, was the couple's 6-month-old chocolate lab. Muddy and slobbering, he wriggled back and forth from one side of the white runner to the other, greeting each and every person sitting in the aisle seat, until he reached the front and his people. Jess and Jake stood stunned as he made his way toward them. 2 beautiful deer in headlights. They had tied their puppy up behind their house, but he'd somehow managed to break free in order to join the celebration. The bride and groom held him by his collar for the rest of the ceremony, but the muddy deed had been done. Puppy footprints covered the white walkway, the guests, the wedding party, and the newly married couple. Analog stamps of the unexpected, but also emblems of love. I know the many risks involved with worshiping in an uncontrolled environment, and sometimes the experience is worth the risk. Many of you have suggested that we begin to gather again as a worshiping community, outdoors, in the parking lot, or the labyrinth, or the stage area. I am as eager as anyone to get back to our Sunday morning gatherings, but the decision falls upon the session. We will be visiting our course of action once again at our July meeting, which happens to be scheduled for today. This morning, the ruling elders of NACCP will look at the pros and cons of coming together again. We will explore various issues, such as how to maintain durable social distancing. We will consider things like the use of the church restrooms and how we will handle folks who need rides to and from worship, and those who, once in the parking lot, may need assistance walking to the outdoor sanctuary and then back to their automobiles. Just this past week, the New York Times reported that the virus has infiltrated Sunday sermons, meetings of ministers and Christian youth camps in Colorado and Missouri. It has struck churches that reopened cautiously with face masks and social distancing in the pews, as well as some that defied lockdowns and refused to heed new limits on numbers of worshipers. Pastors and their families have tested positive, as have church ushers, front door greeters, and hundreds of churchgoers. In Texas, about 50 people contracted the virus after a pastor told congregants they could once again hug one another. In Florida, a teenage girl died last month after attending a youth party at her church. In a July 6th article in The Atlantic magazine, Professor of Law and Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, Tess Wilkinson Ryan, writes, "Reopening is a mess. Photographs of crowds jostling outside bars, patrons returning to casinos, and a tightly packed, largely maskless audience listening to President Donald Trump's speech at Mount Rushmore, all show the U.S. careening back to pre-coronavirus norms. Meanwhile, those of us watching at home are like the audience of a horror movie, yelling, "Get out of there!" at our screens. As despair rises, the temptation to shame people who fail at social distancing becomes difficult to resist. But Americans' disgust should be aimed at governments and institutions, not at one another. Individuals are being asked to decide for themselves what chances they should take. But a century of research on human cognition shows that people are bad at assessing risk in complex situations. During a disease outbreak, vague guidance and ambivalent behavioral norms will lead to thoroughly flawed thinking. If a business is open, but you would be foolish to visit it, that is the failure of leadership. As cases in South Carolina surge, we are all looking for ways to come back together. As our state, along with other states, continues to ease restrictions, we are suddenly responsible for making decisions about how to proceed. Professor Wilkinson Ryan says, suddenly the burden is on individuals to engage in some of the most frustrating and confounding cost-benefit analysis of their lives. In the instance of NACCP, in the matter of how best to worship God, the burden of it, of if, when, and how to reopen for worship, falls on the session to determine. And yet, you as members of the community will still be asked to decide for yourselves what chances you are willing to take as individuals. If we reestablish Sunday morning worship, will you risk attending? If we do not reopen, will you choose to find another worshiping community with which to gather? Quite frankly, it is a conundrum, and it is not going to get any easier for a very long time. Professor Wilkinson Ryan writes, as states gradually reopen, seemingly simple judgments are likely to grow more fraught. What does 6 feet between people look like? The literature suggests that I am more confident I'm 6 feet away from a friend than from a stranger, that I'm more likely to blame people not of my race for standing too close, that I overestimate my compliance with public health guidance, but underestimate yours. Humans have difficulty calculating exponents, which is particularly crucial to understanding the speed of disease spread. They struggle to estimate the correct answer to a problem without drifting toward the answer that best serves their own interest. With more freedom of movement, Americans also have more opportunities to make judgments of others, who always seem to be doing it wrong. How can people be sitting in groups, chatting at an outdoor bar? Who would take their kid to swim in a public pool? Are you inviting these people inside your house? I confess to you that I myself have stumbled into that hypercritical hole. I have for nearly 5 months been hypervigilant regarding care for myself and others in the midst of COVID. I admit harboring anger at those who appear to have no regard for themselves, much less the people around them. And yet I agree with Tess Wilkinson Ryan when she says that this kind of shaming is useless or even harmful to a society. Quite frankly, it even feels harmful to me. Being judgmental is a trait I find repellent, and I certainly don't want to see a judgmental person in my own mirror. Here is Wilkinson Ryan again. For social distancing shaming to be a valuable public health tool, average citizens should reserve it for overt defiance of clear official directives, failure to wear a mask when one is required, rather than mere cases of flawed judgment. The bad judgment that really deserves shaming, including the failure to facilitate testing, failure to protect essential workers, failure to release larger numbers of prisoners from facilities that have become COVID-19 hotspots, and failure to create the material conditions that permit strict isolation. America's half-hearted reopening is a psychological morass, a setup for defeat that will be easy to blame on irresponsible individuals, while culpable institutions evade scrutiny. As I contemplate my words to you this morning, I am reminded of the Samaritan woman at the well. You know, the one who had had 5 husbands. Jesus does not shame her, but instead he talks to her about worship. He says, God is a spirit, and God's worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. Jesus counsels that true worship of God is not geographically defined, but is defined instead by God's own nature, which is spirit and truth. The spirit is wind, and it cannot be contained. Truth is a verb, not a noun. It is something one does. According to the Hebrew definition, truth is also certainty. I love what happens in the end of John's story. In certainty, the nameless Samaritan woman leaves her jug of water, perhaps her shame, behind, and filled with the Spirit, runs into town, imploring the people to come and see. Her worship becomes an act of witness. My beloved friends, I do not know what your session will decide regarding the nature of our Sunday morning rituals of worship. What I do know is that the coronavirus is not discriminating. It is, in fact, much like that buoyant chocolate lab entering a space of worship, its many little feet covered with wet mud. The irony of it all is that I also know God to be like that wet and muddy puppy, uncontainable, exuberant, leaving fingerprints in the most unexpected places. And the Spirit can be like the rough waters of a typically placid river. Worship is like that too. We can do our best to try to control what happens, but in the end, the Holy Spirit moves in ways we cannot begin to anticipate. So our worship needs to be fluid as well, adapting to the realities on the ground. May we worship in spirit and in truth, with open and grace-filled hearts, acting responsibly with care and concern for others, while at the same time embodying the passion and spontaneity of the Samaritan woman, whose heart has been filled with the Spirit and who worships with her deeds. Amen.